question of regulation has already been mentioned a couple of times. So we want to look a little bit at the fact, what about competition? What about regulation? How is it intertwined? What can achieve what? Is it complementary? Is it contradictory? I'm very honored that my dear colleague, Martijn Snoep, is going to chair this panel. Martijn, the floor is yours and your team.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas. I know it's been a long day. I realize that. And I think a lot of people are probably in need of some fresh air and maybe a drink, but we promise you a full hour of heated entertainment. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a ride because we have 4 fantastic speakers on this panel. The topic is we pick up on a theme that has, kind of dominated, I would say, the entire day today, and that picked up with a passionate debate after lunch, which was by Timotheus Hutges. What did he say? Less, and he meant regulation. So get rid of regulation. The panel after that allowed for a bit more nuanced view. I think there were divergent opinions, maybe a little bit of regulation, maybe not too much, or maybe a little bit more. And I think the theme for this panel is, what is the right balance between competition and regulation? And we divide this up into 4 segments. So the first segment is, that right balance between, on the one hand, unfettered, free competition, no regulation whatsoever, and on the other hand, strict economic regulation to achieve certain societal goals. Second, a topic that was not discussed too much so far was, what is the meaning of competitive neutrality? How important is competitive neutrality? And can competitive neutrality, does it even make sense in a world which is dominated by geopolitical forces and not everyone is playing by the same rules anymore? And then thirdly, we are guests of a competition authority. We have 2 competition authorities on the panel. What is the role of competition authorities in all this? What should they do? Strict enforcement, stay in their lane, or do they have an advocacy role in this debate? And then the 4th topic is, what are actually the best ways for competition authorities to use their powers, to use their skills, to use their influence in getting to the right balance of competition and regulation? The 4 panelists on my left hand, Justus Haucap, Professor of Economics in Düsseldorf, António Gomes, Deputy Director of the OECD, Cani Fernández, President of the CNMC, the Spanish Competition Authority, and much more, and David Kemei, who is the Director General of the Kenyan Competition Authority. So let's delve into it and start with the first question that we will discuss for about 15 minutes. What is the right balance between competition and regulation? Justus.
That's a very good question indeed, because Andreas Mund was asking, is it complementary or substitutive? And I think to some degree it's actually both in a way. So often we have markets, almost all markets are regulated to some degree. And I think it's important to distinguish between types of regulation that are competition enhancing or competition facilitating, and types of regulation that rather hinder competition. And we don't discuss this really, but we all know that it's probably a very good regulation in many markets that, for example, quacks cannot offer medical services, but you have to have a degree in medicine. Yeah, that limits competition to some degree, but we think it's a good regulation because it facilitates and keeps the market working. But of course, we also have regulations that hinder competition. If we think about pharmacies in most of Europe, there are all types of regulations that probably do not facilitate competition, but rather hinder regulation. And now I like your introduction that sort of currently we have a tendency in Europe that we say we have too much regulation. And I agree that probably that is quite correct in many markets. But still, if we think about what type of regulation do we want to get rid of, we should maybe distinguish between what type of regulation is competition facilitating or competition protecting or enhancing, such as, I would say, the DMA, for example, which largely facilitates or protects competition in markets, and what type of regulation rather prevents or softens competition. And often we have cases where there are good intentions with regulation, and they often are really focused on something that is completely unrelated to competition. For example, data protection. Yeah, we have data protection guidelines, and I think when we sort of implemented data protection guidelines, nobody really thought about what does it do to competition, for example. And now we see sort of first evidence emerging that the competition protection guidelines may have a collateral damage in the say that smaller companies, small or medium-sized companies find it much more difficult to deal with this type of regulations, and they have an unintended consequence of concentrating markets. That was not the intention, of course, but it's more collateral damage of this type of regulation that we see in, let's say, sustainability regulations, all type of regulations. From an economic perspective, it's quite clear in some sense, because regulation often involves fixed cost for companies. And if you're small companies, you find it always more difficult to deal with fixed cost because you can spread it across a lower quantity. And if you're a large company, you find it typically much more easy to deal with regulation. And many, many years ago, when I was part of the Monopolies Commission, we made a suggestion that, or recommendation to the German government that was unfortunately never taken up, that we suggested that the Bundeskartellamt, the Federal Cartel Office, would get a right to be heard in all government legislation with the perspective, are there any expected effects on competition? Because typically, it's not even, I think, something that politicians sort of intentionally want to reduce competition, but sort of the voice that competition may be harmed by something is often not heard. And unfortunately, this suggestion went nowhere. So I thought maybe 10 years later, it's a chance to repeat it. Because we have apparently a situation in many markets of over-regulation, which are direct costs to firms, but the concentrating effects that these regulations can sort of develop or involved are not taken into account enough. So by and large, I think it's complementary. Often we know that for a long time. Sector regulation, telecommunications was all market opening. But now we have many, many regulations where I am concerned that they actually may also.
Can you give an example? Something. What is, what keeps you awake at night? In the sense, I wish that regulation was gone.
Yeah, well, I have to admit there is maybe a conflict of interest. I'm often working for competitors of Deutsche Post. And there we have, it's not a regulation, but we have a tax exemption, VAT exemption for certain types of letter services, which only Deutsche Post is basically getting at the moment, while the competitors don't get it. And currently we see a situation where the market is more or less, the competition is dying at the moment. And I think the intention of this particular tax law was, I think, never to cut off competition, really, but now that's the side effect that we see, and I think that's very unfortunate, so to say.
And how should the legislator prioritize? I mean, there are so many regulations. Where to start? What would you kind of, as a professor of economics, where would you say, okay, start in this area first?
Well, currently, if we sort of connecting to the discussion that we had on the previous panel, I would say it seems to me that maybe not even the material content of the sort of data protection guidelines, but the actually execution seems to prevent innovation and competition in many markets. Think about the AI Act. There we have a combination of very sort of uncertain legal terms with potentially high damages that is not particularly innovation friendly, let's say. So I would say, as I would like, as a sort of core question that we always ask ourselves, is this particular regulation enhancing competition, or is it actually softening competition in the market?
And António, before we move to the kind of the competitive neutrality, I know the OECD is also active in this area in the sense of advising governments between the right balance between competition and regulation. Can you tell us something about, you know, kind of what are basic rules that come out of OECD research?
Yeah, let me start by saying that first, thank you very much, Andreas, for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Berlin. And just to say that I agree with a lot of what Justus has said. Perhaps the only thing that I may question is whether we should only get rid of those regulations that are not competition enhancing, because that seems to mean that that regulation is there for no purpose. And I think that we need to start with a purpose. So the most important thing is to understand the policy objectives of regulation, and this is the starting point for the OECD competition assessment, the recommendation, and the toolkit that we use. It's up to policymakers to define the policy objectives that they want to achieve with regulation. The problem that we have nowadays is that we do have restrictions to competition, but sometimes either we don't know exactly what the policy objective is, or we have competing and contradicting policy objectives, and we don't really know what we're choosing. If we're choosing competition against security, or if we're choosing competition against, for example, a social issue or an environmental issue, or even competitiveness and growth, because sometimes it's not possible to achieve all the objectives at once. But one thing is clear. I think that everyone, and businesses, we've heard businesses today, but I think that a lot of people are saying we have over-regulation or excess of regulation, sometimes contradicting regulation. It's not harmonized, it's fragmented, it's burdensome, it's inconsistent. And I think that it's an alert. It's basically saying, okay, maybe it's not achieving. If we have all of this, we're probably not achieving the goals the very goals that regulation wants to achieve. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that you always need to do regulatory reform. It's not something that you do once in a decade, and then you can do it again in 10 years' time. There's new regulation all the time. So I think that it's quite important that you do this competition assessment, whether it's in regulatory impact assessment or independently, or it's the competition authority or the policymaker. We always need to think, do we have the right regulation, and is regulation hampering competition? And I want to mention the EU, because there was a lot of discussion on we haven't achieved the single market yet, or at least not fully. And I want to say that it's quite clear to me, and you were asking what could be the priorities. It's quite clear to me that especially on the services area, if we think of financial services, if we think of energy, if we think of telecoms, if we think of transport, if we think of professional services, the single market is not yet functioning as it should. And so it's quite important that we deal with this fragmentation. This is, in my view, a priority. But sometimes it's not just about saying it's less regulation. We're just dropping or eliminating regulation. We may need indeed to adjust regulation, but especially we need better regulation. We need to make sure that we know why we have the regulation, what are the policy objectives, and that we are achieving them in the right way. And of course, because there's been advertising today in a few panels already, and some of the speakers, I also want to advertise the OECD Competition Assessment Toolkit as a very useful tool in this regard.
And António, are there countries where that can provide a good example for other countries in terms of regular regulatory review? Because I think in the experience of lots of people is politicians like to make new laws, not necessarily clean up old laws. I mean, that doesn't get you votes. So how to solve this issue?
Well, I think that leads to a bit the coordination and international sharing of expertise that we need here. Everyone, I think that a lot of the competition authorities in this room and at the OECD and at the ICN have been engaging with their government somehow, and I think we'll be talking about that, about the role of competition authorities, what kind of tools you can use. We've done at the OECD several competition assessment reviews. We've reviewed from Greece during the financial crisis, to Brazil, to Iceland, and even to the ASEAN markets, for example. We've looked at more than 19 sectors, from construction to manufacturing to tourism to energy, et cetera, et cetera. So again, these are valuable resources. You're never going to have a one-size-fits-all response to what to do with regulation. And that links precisely to what I was saying, because policy objectives are not necessarily the same. But you do get ideas from others on how to do this.
And so how does it work in practice? A member of the OECD can come to the OECD and says, well, can you review my slate of economic regulation, please? How does it work?
I think that when we designed the competition assessment toolkit, it was not meant to be the OECD providing support to countries. Yeah. It was actually a tool for countries themselves, even for policymakers, for governments and parliaments to start using the tool directly. And then we started receiving calls. Can you help us? And our objective when we're doing a competition assessment with a country is not that we're doing it ourselves. We're not doing consultancy, we're doing capacity building. It only makes sense if we are giving the tools to the country to then continue doing it. Because as I said, doing competition assessment of regulation is not something that you do one-off. It's not something that you do once in a decade and then you come back to it in 20 years. No, you actually need to do it constantly. So you need to have the tools, you need to know how to do it. But we've designed something that is relatively simple, which is the competition assessment checklist, which basically just looks at 4 very simple things. Does the regulation limit the number of or range of suppliers? Does it limit the ability of suppliers to compete? Does it reduce the incentives of suppliers to compete? Or does it limit the choices and information available to consumers? Now, it doesn't mean you should scrap regulation if you answer positively to any of this, but it means you need to look at it. Yeah. And the problem now is that we have so much regulation and at such a fast speed that, again, maybe we need to use, and I was talking to Cani about this, maybe we need to use AI to start understanding where are the overlaps and precisely where are the inconsistencies, what could we potentially simplify.
You have to upload your toolkit.
Yes. We need to update our toolkit with AI as well.
I think the CEO of Deutsche Telekom had also a fantasy about moving all the regulation into a ChatGPT and then getting one rule book. Maybe moving to the kind of the second theme, competitive neutrality. Did I understand correctly that competitive neutrality as such is not part of this assessment? Is it kind of a separate assessment? Can you explain a little bit and also explain, why competitive neutrality, what is it and why is it important?
So I would say that competitive neutrality is a sub-product of competition assessment. It's not just about regulation. It's not just about legislation and regulation, but it's about any state intervention and making sure that any state intervention will preserve the level playing field. So it's trying to make sure that independently, regardless of the ownership of the company, whether it's state-owned or whether it's private-owned, regardless of nationality, whether it's a domestic or a foreign firm, or regardless of legal form, that the state, by its actions, by regulation or by procurement or by state support, etc., they are not necessarily selecting winners. So the firms should be competing simply on their merits. And again, that's why we've then in 2021 had a recommendation on competitive neutrality that was adhered to by 41 countries. And it's really a way of preserving the level playing field and ensuring that we're not distorting the competition and we're not tilting. I think that it's the idea we're not tilting the playing field in favor of selected companies. So on rules and regulations, this means that firms should be facing the same rules and the rules should be enforced in the same manner. But now, we see that there are exclusions to these. And sometimes they may be good and sometimes they may be bad. And some exclusions that sometimes are bad are, for example, grandfather clauses that basically protect the incumbents from new rules that are being imposed to new entrants. You also have sometimes state-owned enterprises that don't have to face the same licensing requirements or the same regulatory fees that private companies have to. But and again, this discourages entry, discourages even investment by incumbents. It leads to inefficient production, higher prices, and so on. But then you may also have situations where it can actually be positive. So there are situations where there may be an overriding policy objective, for example, that justifies that you create an exception. And I wanted, and because you already mentioned the challenges, and I think that all these balancing act that policymakers nowadays have to do, I think that they are becoming more and more difficult. And for example, we talked about geopolitical tensions, we talked about trade frictions, we talked about fragmentation, rapid technological change, growing government intervention in the economies, but also state-owned enterprises being more active in the international markets, and competition for natural resources. I haven't necessarily heard of that today, but it's also an issue. And nowadays we're starting more and more to say we need to take into account national security, we need to take into account economic security, we need to take into account strategic autonomy, and that may justify reducing or limiting competitive neutrality, as you said right at the beginning. But we always need to think, and going back to the policy objectives, countries want a lot of things, but certainly they want to protect their national security, economic security, strategic autonomy, but they also want productivity, innovation, and growth. So it's very important to calibrate very well any limitation to competitive neutrality. So do we want to restrict sources of supply? Is that going to be good for our innovation and growth and competitiveness? Do we want to limit the intervention of companies in procurement processes? Do we want to limit foreign direct investment coming into our countries? And this is really a difficult balance. I just wanted very quickly to give some examples. We talked about defense already. And it's true that the priority is really to address and meet the security needs and the defense capabilities of countries. But should that mean that we should neglect competition and innovation there? If we design funding and if we design procurement processes and mechanisms that even with the restricted context of competitive neutrality, we may be saying, we're not procuring from Russia, I'll give you an example, but so we need to limit our procurement. But even in that limited sphere, can we still protect competition? Can we still protect innovation? Can you still involve startups in all of this? Rather than risking consolidating market power and having enduring dependencies, which we already mentioned here today. And one final thing, if you allow me, I know that I'm being long, but it's FDI screening. And again, I've asked do we really want to limit the investment that comes into our countries, or do we want to limit at what level do we want to limit? And it's perfectly understandable. We may not want certain foreign investors to be in sensitive locations, to be in sensitive companies dealing with critical infrastructure because of espionage, sabotage, access to sensitive data, technological leakages, and so on. But we need to make sure that if we have a system, that system is not going to be a discouragement for investment. And I need to say that at the EU level, for example, the EU FDI screening regulation that we've had until now didn't do a very good job. It was not a mandatory one, but it was something that would allow different scopes, different procedures across Europe. And again, I think that the revision and the OECD supported the Commission in this process, but the recent revision of the EU FDI regulation makes a much better job in at least creating a sort of a level playing field across Europe. But again, never forget, this is always a balancing act. And policymakers need to really find a sweet spot between limiting competition and achieving its objectives, and what are the objectives, or rather having promoting competition, innovation, productivity.
Before we move to the, is that me? No, something. Before we move to the role of competition authorities, David, a question to you: if competitive neutrality and issues around protecting incumbent companies, protecting small, medium-sized companies against larger companies, maybe from outside Kenya. How does that affect the economy in Kenya, and how do you look at it?
Thank you, Martin, and the President, Andreas, for the opportunity and invitation to attend this international competition conference. Thank you for your question. I think it's a very valid question for Kenya. One is that in our Act, it provides that when we are looking at merger controls and all that, we ensure that we take into account a few items on public interest, so that then you are able to balance in terms of neutrality. So our Act requires that as we analyze and approve mergers, we make sure that we ensure that we do the assessment to ensure that it will not lessen competition, or if it does, we reject it outrightly, or we could actually include some remedies in that decision. And in our case, in most of the cases, is that we have insisted that the emerging companies retain the staff for at least 1 year when they merge. And then secondly is that they retain some of the contracts that they have with small enterprises. Again, trying to ensure that when the merger takes effect, you have some protection and continuity in those two aspects for public interest. In addition to that, also, we have tried our best to ensure that our Act and our guidelines are clear enough so that there's certainty in terms of our regulations in our markets.
Yeah. Yeah.
In addition to that, also, we have also moved ahead to amend our Act for the third time, and this is to make room for the authority to regulate the digital markets. And in preparation for that, we've made some modest investment in forensic lab, which will enable us to really do the investigations, analyze data and all that. It is in preparation phase because we have not received yet the kind of law has not passed through our parliament for us to be able to do that much. In addition to that is that we have undertaken targeted market studies to know actually why do we have some market failures in our economy, and then the aim is still to balance again in the issues of innovation and regulation, so that we are able to intervene correctly, taking into account policy requirements as has been mentioned by Gomes. So those are some of the aspects that we have undertaken.
It would be very interesting to get back to the kind of the sector inquiries and the market studies that you've done, also in light of this discussion. And that segues into kind of the question is, what is the role of competition authorities in all this? Are they kind of bystanders that should just simply enforce the laws that are enacted by the legislator? Or do they also have a role in influencing advocacy through advocacy means the legislator in maybe introducing new laws or amending laws or maybe even taking laws away? Cani, what's your view on that?
Well, I think competition authorities have a role to play in everything you said, in enforcement, also in advocacy, and also in institutional awareness, or in a way, if you have the portfolio that we both share, we are both regulators on top of competition authorities, then you also have the possibility of yourself using that supervision/regulation in order to try to balance the right degree between competition and regulation, and also be sufficiently careful with the competitive neutrality principle. And I will illustrate this with some examples. In the enforcement area, there are many situations in which you can observe how the incumbent, if it is a public company, still enjoys some privileges that could unbalance the situation in the market. That, well, there is already the Court of Justice on the cases that recently analyzed whether replicability has also to take into account or not elements that would come from a publicly owned or a publicly privileged situation. So that's already an element that we can take into account in the enforcement. Or cases like, I will illustrate it with one that we adopted in Spain, and then that we were discussing when we launched the neutrality toolkit at the OECD level. We sanctioned the General Council of court awards, I mean, the court agents that are helping in the process, in all the procedures, because they were trying to leverage in their public service position in a non-public and private area, which was out-of-court auctions. They had created a platform, an e-platform that was really, it was really very efficient, but they were announcing it as the only public and administrative, the one that was in connection with the judges, which was not true. So we imposed a fine on them because they were in fact leveraging a public idea of administrative elements into private. So in enforcement, there are many areas in which you can really try to strike that balance. Advocacy is nevertheless my favorite area, and I have to say that we do have in Spain what you were wishing for. We do have an obligation by law that to provide our opinion in every single project of norm, of law that may affect the market. Problem is that when it is under the urgent procedure, they can not ask us to provide our opinion, which has happened during the crisis in many cases, as you know. But still, we have been able to really give our opinion on good regulation on the basis of proportionality, less restrictive element for competition itself, and impact in the market from a competition point of view. And it is working quite well because normally, and in particular regional parliaments in Spain are following us much more than the central parliament, but at least we are able to, I mean, to include this element of not too much regulation. In order to be able to detect when we see that regulation is jeopardizing competition or is restricting economic activity, we have developed an AI tool that's called Lexia, so Lex AI, that is through web scraping and natural language processing is reading all the public gazettes with all the regulation that is adopted in Spain at all levels, so the central level, and regional level, and also municipalities, in order to detect, on the basis of good legislation principles that we have consistently adopted at the CNMC, which of those regulations that are adopted every single year, every single day, are compatible or not. Because what we want to do with this is going into the preventive instead of, we do have the possibility of challenging before court any regulation below the level of act that would jeopardize competition or restrict economic activity unnecessarily, and we have a high level of success with that, but it is too late normally. So with this Lexia tool that we are now using, I mean, we've been testing it for the last 2 years, and now we are using it actively, we are able to detect regulation and then get in touch immediately with the legislative, and we've been able to withdraw that regulation or modify it, because sometimes it's just a question of not knowing that what they are doing could be done in a much more competitive way. So that's the area of advocacy in the design of legislation. And another thing that I think competition authorities have to be extremely careful about is that whenever there is a crisis, whether it is the COVID or economic or energy crisis or wherever, a state intervention goes into the economy in a very rapid way, and in a way, it's accepted by everybody because everybody is wanting to have further state helping us with the problem. The problem is that when the crisis starts to more or less go away, that intervention is there. So competition authorities have to be there to remind everyone that only with competition, markets regain the necessary objectivity, the necessary elements for innovation. So for example, in 2021, we adopted a document at the CNMC, recommendations to the public authorities for an intervention in favor of market competition and inclusive economic recovery, where we were creating 3 decalogues, one regarding public intervention in the economy, the second one state aid, in order to make it compatible with competition principles, and the last one was public procurement. And in that last note, I will finish my intervention now, because in public procurement, and this goes directly to the competition neutrality thing, one of the things that we are doing is reminding all the public authorities that are dealing with public procurement that in-house adjudication, because we have such a complicated and bureaucratic public procurement regulation. I think we all agree with this. We've discussed it so many times, and we've suffered it as authorities when we have to use it. I mean, it's not working in Europe, and it should be simplified, if not completely deregulated. The thing is that in-house is much easier. So the temptation of going to public companies or in-house companies is there. So clearly killing the competitive neutrality thing, because it's speedier, it's easier, and then excluding companies from markets. And we have included a specific chapter in our public procurement guide regarding in-house, sending messages to protect competitive neutrality. I will leave it here, and we can discuss later.
Thank you very much. Justus, for those in the room who are not from Germany, and also on the panel who are not from Germany, what is the role of the Monopolkommission and of the Bundeskartellamt in kind of addressing over-regulation? What is the role, and what, in your opinion, should their role be?
Well, Germany has a somewhat awkward system in that sense, that we have the Bundeskartellamt who is enforcing competition law and also doing a lot of advocacy and so on. The Monopolies Commission is more a policy advisory role. On the one hand, it also has a slight role in this ministerial overrides, and it has a role also in actually reporting on what the Bundeskartellamt does to Parliament. So the Monopolies Commission can write about anything that it wants, so to say. So there have been reports on competition between universities, for example, where the Bundeskartellamt, I think, has, apart from university hospitals, I think never dealt with. The Monopolies Commission can do something in that sense, but it has not the sort of this strong advocacy role that I've now learned, very fascinating, that is actually sort of active in Spain.
But the Monopol Commission could do that in theory.
In principle, they could do, and I think that it is quite often actually that. It's my experience that sort of as was said, that there's some totally different objectives there that you try to pursue with regulation, and there's very little effort spent on thinking sort of how can we sort of align this better with competition, for example. To give you one example, in Germany we have quite high subsidies for heat pumps at the moment. And by and large, and now everyone is wondering why are heat pumps so expensive in Germany? Because they're much more expensive than in all other European countries by and large. And the interesting thing is that the subsidy that you get when you buy a heat pump is the higher, the more expensive the heat pump is. Yeah, and I learned that Japan, for example, has a different system where, to simplify it a bit, by and large, you get a higher subsidy the lower the price of the heat pump. Yeah, so they have a very simple same objective. We want to have more heat pumps, so to say. Yeah, but you can better align it with competition if you spend a little bit more of your sort of brain on thinking how can we sort of incentivize competition in markets.
But coming back to the role of the competition authorities, do you think should the Bundeskartellamt provide unsolicited advice to the government, change the system because it's not good for competition and it's not meeting its objectives, or should the Monopol Commission do that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
In the end, I'm a bit indifferent. I must say, at least as somebody. So at the moment, there's nobody sort of is really sort of tasked like like it is in Spain, and I would be very happy if there was one agency, whether it is the Monopolies Commission or whether it's the Bundeskartellamt that does it, but sort of systematically giving advice to every type of legislative act on what does it do. Sort of, I remember that in Australia there was always a statement in sort of legal proposals. Yeah, what does it do to competitive neutrality? And this is something that we are missing, I think, here at the moment.
Oh, very good. This is, I think, a nice way, a nice bridge to move to the fourth topic and last topic is, what are for competition authorities, and of course, Cani already alluded to that. What are the most effective tools and way of working to influence the debate? The debate about new regulation, about old regulation does not meet its objectives. And David, you already said something about your sector inquiries, your market studies. That is part of your role in the Kenyan economy, also with respect to regulation. Can you just tell us a little bit about
that? Thank you again to give me an opportunity. I wanted to say that we actually carry out targeted market studies to understand why do we have some market failures in some of our sectors. And once we conclude, we actually inform policy, inform a legislative agenda, we send our recommendations to government.
And that's, sorry to interrupt, so
the
that's
flip side of that is
market failure and regulatory failure.
Yes, yes. The flip side of that is that our law doesn't give us the ability, to implement the kind of policies that we have. So that's where there is only something that we need to do, so that when we come up with recommendations that we know will really help with the promoting competition, we could be able to execute. So that's the flip side of that. Also, we engage with our stakeholders whenever we come up with something new or whenever we see something that is going to affect competition. And these are the main stakeholders, are the lawyers in our environment, other agencies that we work with, like QuadC, who are here, East African Competition Authority, who are here. We also have AFCFTA, who are also around. We work together, and then also in Kenya, we have so many other regulators for the different sectors. Again, we do our best to work together so that we can promote competition issues.
Yeah.
Also, in terms of advocacy, we have on an annual basis where we visit the different cities to be able to bring together businessmen, bring together small business, bring together the lawyers, so that we can actually make them understand what we are doing as IKK. This is aimed at to ensure that our businesses are able to better comply with our rules and the rest. As I speak here, there are 3 teams in Kenya that have gone to different places for the same kind of engagement and advocacy for competition issues in Kenya. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cani, of the things you've tried, or what is in your view for the CNMC kind of the most effective tool? How do you influence most effectively as a competition authority?
I think it's a combination, I would say. And going into your point, and maybe I can give you a piece of advice, because we have exactly the same thing as you have. We do have market studies, and we don't have the possibility of executing our recommendations ourselves, so we don't have a new competition tool. But what we are doing more and more is the following, and I will illustrate it with an example. I think Spain is probably the last member state that has not yet liberalized the coach or the bus transport long distance, so over 100 kilometers. It's still under concession. It's extremely inefficient, and we did a market study, and we observed that it was for the more vulnerable consumers, the ones that are paying excessive prices. So we did the market study. We concluded with some recommendations in favor of liberalization, and this was like 4 years ago. Of course, no answer by the government. So last year we did an impact assessment. So we did an econometric study on how much we would have saved the consumers if our recommendations would have been followed. And of course, all the media went to publish it. Now the government is thinking of liberalizing at least some routes because the pressure is high. So think of things, I mean, you become very effective, and that is the gist of it, when you are able to communicate what you are doing and the results of what you are doing. So I would go for that route.
And I think it is really good, and I can also imagine the headlines will say, you know, if you do this, it will save the consumers this much. But do you repeat that? In the sense, do you do this annually? I'm sure they will not immediately say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, so it will take a while.
Every single year we do an impact assessment.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that I wanted in my mandate, that I mean, accountability of what we are doing and we are providing, and we choose every year, we choose something.
Something new.
Yeah,
okay.
So we did the impact assessment on this because it was rather clear that nothing was happening, and we have had 3 ministers on a row promising that they were going to do it, then the minister changed, another minister, so we decided to do it. But for example, the last year we did an impact assessment on the savings of the subsidies to self-consumption and self-generation in photovoltaic in Spain. That was very interesting. In order, again, to try to send messages of better design in the subsidies, whether they were efficient or not. We've done the same thing in subsidies granted in the interconnection between mainland Spain and the islands, whether the system of subsidizing the tickets is better or not, whether the prices are going higher than needed. So we try to do impact assessments in things that are intervention of the administration into the economy to send messages for them to be more effective.
Yeah, very good. António, we heard some really great examples from Spain, from Kenya. Are there other competition authorities that we can learn from?
Yeah, first of all, I think that Spain is relatively privileged because precisely you can challenge certain regulations and legislation in court, right? And you're only one of a few countries like Sweden and Italy, I think, that can also do this. There are countries that have this exceptional power, like Peru, to actually remove anti-competitive acts. But again, I'm not sure that we would all be ready to take on that, that responsibility. So mostly, I would say that most authorities, what they have is really their advocacy powers to convince policymakers. But I would say more than convincing them is supporting them in actually go through the process and do the assessment. And never forget that competition authorities have really a know-how on markets, but also we talked about incentives of market players that other institutions do not have. And I do understand that sometimes competition authorities say, but I have already so much work in terms of enforcement, I cannot be checking every single piece of legislation. And I must confess, when I was an enforcer, and I was president of the competition authority, at some point the Commission was trying to push during the Troika years, the financial assistance to Portugal. They were trying to push, no, but António, don't you want to have powers to screen every single piece of legislation? We can put it in the memorandum of understanding. And they said, no, we're not ready. I want to be selective. I want to be able to choose what is more relevant. And again, looking at Europe, and I don't know what involvement DG Comp in Europe could have on this, but looking at services, looking at how financial markets, I know it's also the other commissioner, another DG looking at this, but energy, looking at professional services, looking at financial markets. If we want to get AI to move forward, we've talked about, you mentioned the 5 things that we need. Venture capital you mentioned, but we also need to deepen capital markets.
Lower energy.
We need energy that functions.
Let's interconnect the south that is providing
we need
for
to lower barriers to
renewable.
renewables, etc., etc. So again, competition authorities have a very important role here.
Well, thank you very much, António. I think we should stop here. That's that's really good. And I think what the panel provided was really an excellent, nuanced view on the relationship between competition and regulation. I think I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you also for giving competition authorities and practitioners and politicians also a perspective of what competition authorities can do. And I ask the audience to join me in an applause for the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martijn.
Thank you.
Thank you very well.
Well, thank you very much, Martijn. You kept your promise. I never had thought that regulation and competition could be so fruitful and entertaining at the same time. So many thanks for that.